When we talk about climate change, we usually picture heat waves and scorched earth. But for birds, the real danger might actually be the rain. I'm Kathy Mueller. This is Wild About Wildlife, and today we're exploring what might be a little bit of a surprising threat to biodiversity. Western University biology professor Alice Boyle has been studying how shifting rain patterns are shaping bird populations. Alice, thanks for being here today. It's actually quite appropriate that we're recording this on what started out anyway as a pretty soggy morning in southwestern Ontario.
That's right. It's a rainy day here.
And so, in general, in the past, how has rainfall played a role in shaping bird populations?
We don't really know. It probably has, but we're not really sure how or why. It's a relatively new avenue of research, but one that I think is very relevant to our current context. So people have included, people have modeled how birds and other animals respond to weather variables, and often have included rainfall in sort of predictive models, that sort of thing. But without too much in the way of clear predictions about how and why those rainfall relationships might exist. And if they did have predictions, it was often something about food availability, because we do know that when it's very dry, there's not a lot of plant productivity, there's not a lot of bugs and fruit and other things that animals eat.
Right.
And so when it's very dry, then more rainfall is a good thing, but it's more complicated than just food.
And more complicated than lack of rain or too much rain, right? It goes much deeper
Exactly.
than this. So this is something I'm assuming that your study was looking into. And can you tell us about it? It was recently published in the very prestigious Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So yeah, tell us a little bit about what you were trying to do through this research.
It really grew out of two things. One was I've studied birds in really rainy places for quite a long time. As a postdoc and even PhD student, I worked in the tropics, where in a very, very, very wet place, in a place that gets over 8 meters of rain a year. Though that's up there,
Yeah.
in the global scope of how rainy it can be. And conclusions from that were pretty clear that rain can be a bad thing. And so for many years, I mulled this over, and it was a surprise to people that there could be good and bad responses, positive and negative sort of population level responses. And I sort of synthesized my thoughts about how rain might affect birds and other endotherms about 5 years ago in another paper. But then alongside of that work, I should say that paper laid out a bunch of theory that we can now test. And so as part of testing that, I was also working in grassland systems, and we found interesting relationships between bird reproduction and rainfall. And so it seemed to matter when it rained, whether it was, a good thing or bad thing. And when you think about all the ways that rain can affect birds, some of them act really directly on the bird, like it rains and they get wet, or it rains and other things happen as a direct consequence of that rain. Others happen sort of indirectly, happen via sort of predator communities or via food availability, that sort of thing. And so when we see like these negative responses when the rain is happening during reproduction, it's more likely that those are direct mechanisms linking the rain to the birds.
Okay, so can you give us some examples?
Well, I don't think it's very hard. Like if you went outside on a morning like today when it was raining and you just stood around in a t-shirt or something, and it's like, it's not cold out, but it's, 15 or something. What would happen to you? What would happen if you just stood out there and got wet?
You're going to get cold. It's going to be hard to warm up.
Yes. And the same is true of birds. Now, of course, they are wearing a raincoat. They're wearing feathers, which are water repellent, but we have a harder time keeping warm when it's wet out than when it's not. And birds and humans aren't so different in that regard. So a major cost of rain is either like direct wetting. So that raincoat just not doing its job enough, and rain getting the bird wet right down to the skin, and that causing increasing costs of staying warm. Or the other thing you could do if it's raining is procrastinate to leave the house, right? You could say, yeah, I'm just going to wait a little bit and see if it gets better. And then maybe you miss your bus and maybe you don't make that lunch date or whatever it is. So there are behavioral avoidance sort of strategies that we think that birds probably have. And those bring their own kinds of costs. It means that maybe they don't go out and get as much food as they would have otherwise, or it changes other aspects of what they would normally do if it wasn't raining. So those are some of the sort of like direct things that can happen.
The other thing that popped into my head while you were talking too was I was just talking with a friend over the weekend about this, and who is dealing with some water leaks in her ceiling, impacting potentially her house. So birds' nests, birds'
Yes.
houses too, I would assume, right?
Definitely. So, adult birds, they have like full coats of feathers. They're relatively, they're better at slicking off this rain, but a little nestling, a little fuzzy thing in a nest that's exposed maybe to the elements, or is dependent on the parent, like sort of sheltering them, they're a lot more susceptible to those bad weather events.
Right.
So definitely. And sometimes even in most extreme cases, nests can get flooded, they can get washed away. I've seen nests on the prairie where there's just so much standing water that the eggs and the chicks are actually sitting in a puddle.
Okay. So your study, and you talked a little bit as well about the indirect impact as well. So your study is looking at all of this, and what are some of the findings that came out of this? Like, how and why is the bird reproduction being impacted by the rainfall beyond what we've already just talked about?
One of the most important things we found is that, I should back up a little bit. This is the study that was published was sort of a global analysis, something called a meta-analysis, where you take the results of a whole bunch of different studies and then you use those individual results in a new analysis. So we took data from birds nesting around the world. Anytime when the authors, it includes some metric of like how well their reproduction went and some metric of rainfall, and related those things together. And we wanted to do a number of things. We wanted to determine sort of what are the net effects. Is it positive? Is it negative? Like, is rain generally a good thing? Is it rain generally a bad thing? And if that varies, then what explains why it's good or bad? And does it depend on where you live? Does it depend on how you live? It might matter, like, for instance, whether you're nesting on the ground or whether you're maybe in a cavity in a tree where that's a more protected site. One of the biggest take homes, I think, is that the response, whether it's, rain is a good thing or bad thing, really does depend on the timing of when that rain falls. And so when it falls directly on birds during their nesting attempt, it's a bad thing. And that is consistent with what we predicted. But then if that rain was lagged, so say if over the previous few months or even the previous year, those responses tended to be more positive. And we think those reflect these indirect mechanisms, because it can't really directly affect the reproduction because it's lagged, right? So what it was like last winter might affect how birds do this year. And that's going to be an indirect mechanism. It's going to be either food supply or abundance of predators, or even sort of the vegetation conditions that birds are nesting in, because vegetation structure really can influence how well birds do, how well they can hide their nests from predators and that sort of thing.
And so you were able to narrow it down to this key finding that the timing of the rainfall is one of the key findings, regardless of where the birds are living, like in a colder climate like Canada, or they're migrating south, or they live in the tropics, that's applicable around the world, you're saying?
Around the world, yeah. And that's really exciting when you find something I will say that it's like 172 studies, so it's not like all the birds of the world or anything like that, but it does span a huge range of life histories and body sizes and nesting styles and all these different things that normally sort of confuse the issue, right? But we saw this consistent pattern over that big scale. So that's pretty exciting.
Okay, so and did you find that some bird species are more susceptible than others?
Yeah, there were two other sort of categories of things that we tried. We modeled in the response to rain. One was sort of geographic. Where are you in the world? Are you at low latitudes or high latitudes, like close to the poles or right in the tropics? And also, are you near sea level or are you up high in the mountains? And we predicted that, especially with these direct costs of staying warm, that those would be more noticeable at both higher latitudes and higher elevations because it gets colder
Right.
in general as you go up in elevation, as you go north or south if you're in the southern hemisphere. And in general, that was also true. So the animals that are most at risk are those that breed in the temperate zone at high elevations, which is also consistent with what we thought. And it does implicate this sort of direct cost of the rain on sort of how a bird manages to stay warm, manages its thermoregulation. We also then collected information on all sorts of other things that we might reflect, how exposed a nest might be, or what its food supply is, and how it had to forage, and how rainfall might influence the abundance of food for it in the landscape, or the kind of predators it has. All these other kind of traits related to reproduction that we thought that we were going to use to try to distinguish what, if any, of these indirect mechanisms might lead to the responses we see. And we didn't find any of those traits that were related to the rainfall response, which doesn't mean that they don't ever matter. It just means that overall, at this big global scale, they aren't general predictors. So, on a case by case basis, you might see it mattering, but it doesn't sort of globally matter.
My mind is going in so many different directions because I am not a scientist or a researcher, and just trying to make sense of everything that you're saying. And the we're talking about the potential or the impact on birds reproducing because of rainfall and the timing of rainfall. What is that impact? Is it, I'm going to guess it's fewer babies, but maybe they're having more babies, or they're adapting and having babies at a different time than they normally would. What impact, or did your study look at that?
We did look at sort of number of babies and whether the babies survived, but we were constrained by what the original studies reported. In general, we didn't look for a shift in timing of reproduction, and that's partly because those kinds of responses are more likely to play out over evolutionary time, over multiple generations at least. And that wasn't sort of within the scope of this study. The other thing is that birds don't have a ton, at least the further north you go or south, the closer to the poles you go, birds don't have a lot of leeway there. There's sort of this narrow window of time that is good for reproducing, especially as you get up to more high latitude places. Birds really have only a matter of weeks to get the job done. Whereas sort of maybe in, the southern states, birds can have multiple, reproductive attempts per year. As you go further north, they have fewer and fewer. And it gets to a point where birds arrive, they pair up, they lay a bunch of eggs. And if that nest fails after more than 5 days or 6 days or something of incubation, then that's it. They just can't. They don't have enough time to try again. And so reproduction timing tends to be quite constrained. And I think that's kind of a problem, especially the other thing that matters here is that a lot of those birds that breed at high latitudes are migratory. They're often coming from really far away. And so they can't necessarily respond to the local changes in the place where they're breeding because they aren't getting those cues at the time of year when they need to be getting them. They're somewhere else entirely. So you imagine a bird, say up in Churchill, breeds in Churchill. It maybe here right now, maybe in southern Ontario, like an American tree sparrow or something. And maybe up in Churchill, this is a really warm year. Things are flushing up, the rainfall conditions are just right. Like it would be great to get going, next week. But the birds are here. They don't know that, they're timing those migrations based on primarily based on changing day length cues. And those aren't changing, right? So that mismatch is a bit of a problem there.
So you mentioned one bird that we find here in Canada. It's a global study, but are you able to talk about what you've noticed in birds that do call Canada home?
Well, I mean, if I stick to the conclusions of the study, I would say that the ones that we have to worry about most in this context, in the context of rain anyway, are the ones that breed up in the mountains, and particularly, the further north places. So, I mean, all of Canada is globally further north, but I mean, even within Canada, that probably plays a role. So, but high elevation birds in general, I think, are the ones that are likely to suffer the most from changing rainfall regimes.
I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this next question or not, but if if this theory holds true for birds being impacted by the timing of rainfall, their populations being impacted, can we make the connection that it's likely other species outside of birds are also being similarly impacted?
Obviously, we don't know that for sure, but I would say that there's a very strong likelihood that mammals, the conclusions of this study are extendable to mammals, little small, probably small mammals like chipmunks and ground squirrels and other things like that are likely to be affected as well. And the reason I say mammals is because the costs, these direct costs of rainfall, a lot of them depend on the ability to stay warm. And birds and mammals are the two big groups that have, of terrestrial animals that have endothermy, that try to keep internal temperatures as stable as possible. Our bodies kind of freak out when there's an infection and, our body temperature rises just a little bit, and that's, bad, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
same, and there's a bit more flexibility in the cold side of things, but in general, both birds and mammals are operate best when their internal temperatures are within this narrow range of stable temperatures. And so I think one of the big costs of rain is that it makes maintaining those internal temperatures more difficult. Certainly not the only cost, but it's one of the big costs.
Okay, so getting back to your study and your findings, why does all of this matter?
Well, partly it matters from just sort of a general scientific knowledge kind of point of view. It's a bit remarkable that we have these two big axes of climate, temperature and rainfall, and those things both matter tremendously. And I would overwhelmingly in our studies of animals, and especially endothermic animals, people have focused on temperature. And we have these very nicely worked out pathways from sort of how temperature affects an animal from the level of the cell on up, and we know almost nothing about how rain influences them. And that is obviously very important given the fact that both temperature and climate are changing in our modern world. Just before I get to the climate change aspect, I will say that probably this focus on temperature, it may reflect kind of a temperate zone bias in where so much of the science in our society comes from. And in the tropics, there's no temperature seasonality in the inner tropics. It's, the mean daily temperature is basically unchanging throughout the whole year. And rainfall is the big axis of determining where animals live and what they do and what the habitat looks like, species distributions, the timing of reproduction. It's all shaped by rainfall. And yet we don't know what animals do in the rain. And so that takes me to the second piece, which is, it's not just global warming, it's global climate change. And part of that global climate change is a change in rainfall regime. And again, unlike temperature, rainfall isn't sort of as well worked out in that context. It's not just an overall increase or overall decrease everywhere, but one of the general points of agreement in all these climate models is that rain is getting more unpredictable and more variable, sort of more extremes, longer dry spells, more severe wet weather when it comes, and changes in timing, which I think is potentially one of the most important aspects of change, especially in the tropics, but here too. And so unless we know how and why rain affects animals, we aren't going to be able to know how that aspect of climate change is going to influence where birds can live and what they can do in those places.
So what are your concerns as a researcher, as a biologist, going further, knowing what you know now, what you've been able to compile through this study, and knowing that climate change isn't going anywhere? What are you most concerned about when it comes to the future of bird populations?
I think I'm going to separate that into my concerns for temperate zone birds and my concerns for tropical birds, because although they overlap, I think the biggest concerns are likely different in those areas. So in the temperate zone, I think the bigger magnitude of extremes, we know that big bad storms are bad for birds, hamper reproduction, kill individuals, alter their behavior in the short term, which can sort of escape behaviors. It can totally interrupt, can derail reproduction entirely. I think those kinds of effects are going to be the most consequential for the birds that live in Canada and other, places closer to the poles. In the tropics, I think this changing in timing is going to be the worst thing. So I'm just going to give you a little anecdote. I moved to Costa Rica when I was in my early 20s and started a job, and I moved there in March, which was the dry season. My colleagues said, "Oh, rainy season starts on the 15th of May." I said, "What?"
Okay, at 7 a.m. Yes.
They said, "Yeah." They said, "Yeah, it starts on the 15th of May." And, I just looked at them in disbelief, right? And on the 15th of May, I woke up to a totally unfamiliar sound, and it was rain pounding on the metal roof. And they were right. That doesn't happen anymore. That degree of predictability has really shaped what tropical animals do. It's sort of like that hardwired responses that I was talking about with migratory birds, like they're hardwired to respond to these particular cues. And I think that change in timing is potentially catastrophic. I don't want to extrapolate too far, but I am very concerned about that aspect.
Where do you go now with the findings from your study? What do you do with the information? What can it inform going forward?
I have some work that I hope to start this summer, or at least get all the kinks out of the system this summer, and then start working on that more seriously in the next year. I think there's good evidence now to say, yes, rain does have these population level effects, and rain can be bad. And we have multiple options for how that actually works, sort of behaviorally and physiologically. But what we don't know is we don't actually know what those pathways are. We don't know what birds do when it rains. It's very hard to study. And so I have some experimental work planned that will help distinguish, like, what are those decision points? Is it about the timing? Is it about the duration? How much can they tolerate before they change from a behavioral response to sort of letting body temperature decrease potentially, or going out in the rain and foraging and risk the wetting and incurring additional costs of that. So I hope to be able to figure all that out in the next couple of years.
That doesn't sound like a short study either.
Fortunately, at Western, I have I have a really excellent setup, so I'm excited to be able to do that.
You've used words like the potential impact could be catastrophic. Is there hope? And for someone who's listening, is there something that somebody can do now to help mitigate the impact that your study identified?
Yeah, that's a real tough one. And as an individual, I think it's very easy to feel completely helpless about climate
Yeah.
change. It is true that climate change happens because of the collective actions of humans. And so it doesn't mean that there's not a role for you. Anything you can do to make your carbon footprint smaller and vote for the people who are going to implement the regulations that can curb the emissions at a bigger scale. That is probably the most important thing you can do right now for not only birds, not only rain, but the Earth's biodiversity. Now, if you're looking for things that are more concrete, more local, more specific that you can do for birds, there's a lot you can do that doesn't specifically have to do with weather. And so, I mean, part of the problem is that there are a lot of risks for birds. And we can do things that will help populations of especially migratory birds, but also actually not just migratory birds in general. And so the more we can do for them in the other ways means there'll be more headroom there with the climate change impacts. And so some of the big ones are keeping cats indoors. I'm a very devoted cat servant. I have one cat owner at home, and she keeps me in line. But she does not. She has a catio, actually, a wonderful catio. She can go outside, but she is prevented from eating the wildlife. So caps inside. That's a big one. Lights out at night. This is prime migration season right now. Huge source of mortality of migrating birds is collisions with tall buildings, windows, that sort of thing. Making the cities as dark as possible is one thing we can do there. Minimizing pesticide use, planting native plants, doing what you can to keep the insect biodiversity high in a local scale and in your neighborhood, and educating your neighbors about those kinds of things. You know, don't be the person with the perfect lawn. Those are way overrated.
I agree. I agree.
You can buy bird-friendly coffee. You can buy bird-friendly beef, and that will help the grassland birds. There is a lot you can do for birds generally. Anything people do that helps birds in those other realms will mean that they have a little bit more time and a little bit more sort of potential for coping with those climate change impacts.
That gets to the ripple effect, right? Because you mentioned earlier before, as one person, you may think, oh my gosh, this is such a huge issue. What can I do? You've narrowed it down really well. And then if I start doing it, you start doing it, our neighbors start doing it, right? Then there's that ripple effect, and it just grows from there. That's a much better place to kind of wrap things up on a much more hopeful and positive space. Is there something that we didn't talk about before we do wrap up that you wanted to mention in relation to your study in particular, or anything else that you feel the audience should know?
I think we've covered scientifically the basis. What I do want to say, though, is that I'm the one giving this interview, but any study, this whole body of knowledge, it depends on lots and lots of people's actions and hard work. And I want to acknowledge the lead author of this study, who was a former PhD student in my lab, Katie Silver, for her tremendous role in this work as well.
Wonderful. Yes, it of course takes a team to pull something of this magnitude together, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay, so that is all the time that we have for today. A huge thank you, Alice, for sharing some of these hidden ways that climate change is reshaping the lives of birds. It was fantastic having you on today.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure.
And if you're listening and you know someone who is passionate about birds or just the future of our planet, please share this episode with them. It's the best way to make sure that these important stories reach the right ears. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss a future episode of Wild About Wildlife. Thank you for listening. Remember, when we protect our local ecosystems, we are all helping to keep the wild in wildlife.